Good morning, everybody. Good morning from London, and good afternoon and good evening wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining this webinar organized by the World Biogas Association. My name is David Newman. I'm the World Biogas Association President. And also online you have Dr. Sarika Jain, who is the author of the report that we will be talking about today. Let me thank my colleagues Robert for organizing this, and let me thank also the sponsors of the report, which you can download for free on our website. And the sponsors are DMT of the Netherlands, Genia of Spain, IES Biogas of Italy, and Wangen Pumps from Germany. Without their help, it would have been hard for us to get this done. Now, this is a report which, as I said, you can download both in the full version and in the shorter version from our website for free. And today we're very privileged to have Sarika Jain, who wrote the report, talk to us about it. A little bit of housekeeping. On your Zoom page, you will have at the bottom of it a menu bar. And if you wish to ask us a short question, please use the chat option. And we will do our best within the time of this webinar to answer your question. But if we don't, make sure, please, that when you do ask your question, that your name is registered with it so that we can get back to you later, if necessary, with an email to answer what we cannot answer this morning. The webinar is going to be in two parts. Firstly, Sarika is going to talk about the data, which will be the main part. And then I will talk about some of the policy recommendations which we think are necessary to ensure that the biogas industry grows globally. So thank you very much. Now over to you, Sarika.
Thank you, David, and good morning. I will first try to get my PowerPoint up. Do you have my PowerPoint now?
We do indeed.
Super, thank you, David. So there's a lot of potential in the AD industry. Intuitively, we've known that for a period of time, for a long period of time, in terms of energy security, in terms of food security, waste management, air quality improvement, and climate change mitigation. But just how much? How much energy can we generate? What is the difference that we can make? So this is what we sort of set out to answer in this report. How much greenhouse gas abatement can we do? How much nutrients can we recover using the technology? What is the order of magnitude of the industry? So, hang on. Can you see my next slide? Nope. There you go. So a couple of background slides on the process of anaerobic digestion. I'll not go into details on this one. And then the 9 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that AD contributes to. So where are we as an industry today? There are about 50 million microdigesters currently operating around the world, of which about 42 million are in China, about 5 million in India, and the rest in other parts of Asia, Africa, and South America. Now, most of these digesters utilize biogas directly for cooking or for heating. In addition, there are about 132,000 small, medium, and large-scale digesters, of which 110,000 are in China, about 18,000 in Europe, about 2,200 in the US, and the rest are again spread all across the world. While most of these digesters generate heat and electricity via a CHP, around 700 upgrade the biogas to biomethane. Now, upgrading biogas to biomethane is a relatively new technology, but it's already established. There are about, of the 700, and I'm actually told they're close to 800, but 700 are documented in publicly available documents. So about 550 are in Europe, and the rest are in the US, Canada, India, China, Japan, South Korea, Brazil. So it's pretty much spread all across the globe. Currently, the industry employs about 344,000 people. But what does that all mean? According to our calculations, that is about 2% of the total potential of the industry. So what is the total potential of the industry? What is it that it can do? So I'll go to the answers first and then sort of walk you through the methodology that we used to get to those answers. We can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 12%. And while we are doing that, we can substitute 28% of the coal that is used to generate energy today. And we can replace 6% of the inorganic fertilizer that is currently being used in agriculture. Now, fertilizer requires a lot of energy for production. So it's a pretty big user of energy. Now, how did we arrive at these conclusions? So in the next 3 slides, I'm going to take some time and walk you through the methodology. So we looked at broadly 5 different categories of feedstocks. The first one was food waste and loss, livestock manure, crop residues, energy crop, and sewage. Now, when we talk about food waste and loss, it includes 1.6 billion tons of food waste that we generate every year, including food waste, food loss, inedible parts of food waste, of food. So based on the example of Milan, we assume that if all relevant policies are put in place, it is possible to collect up to 87% of food waste in urban areas. In rural areas, it is, however, more difficult because food waste is often fed to the animals or it is composted on farm. So we assume that there is a capture rate of 50% in rural areas, giving us an overall capture rate of 68.5% for the use of food waste in anaerobic digestion and generation of renewable energy. Now, this is what in the report we call as all available. So when we say all available, it is not like all available would be the whole 1.6, but it's not realistically available. So the portion of it that we think we can realistically collect, it is possible to collect, is what we call all available. And also we assume that going forwards, we have set ourselves under the UN SDGs targets of reducing food waste production to 50% by 2030 and quarter it by 2050. We assume that these will be achieved, and we sort of very proactively support the prevention of food waste generation. The next one is livestock manure. Here we took into consideration manure from cattle, buffaloes, pig, and poultry. And we looked at the common farming practices, and we assumed certain housing percentages for each of these animals. And it is only when they are housed that you can collect their manure. Again, from a animal welfare perspective, we do not encourage more housing of animals, but there is a certain percentage of housing that is required when they're in the night, when it's cold, when they are being milked. So that is the time when we collect the manure. Now, the large farms have the benefit of scale and access to funds, while small farms can implement micro-scale digestion, which has lower capital and infrastructure needs. The mid-sized farms may have, it's a little bit more tricky for them to adopt anaerobic digestion, but they can form cooperatives and community digesters to digest the manure. Now, based on these sort of different scenarios, we assumed that with the right policies, it is possible to collect about 70% of the manure. I mean, and these are all assumptions that we've made, and I think you might sort of agree or disagree, or we can have a conversation about that. But this is what we decided to go with because it just seemed ambitious enough, but realistic enough at the same time. So, so 70% of the manure can be captured for the production of renewable energy and digestate. So the next one is crop residues. Now, crop residues are the part of crop that are not used for as food. It is the stalks and the leaves and the roots. It also includes processing residues. So once you've taken the crop and you've processed, say if it's a cereal crop, you've taken out the cereal, the rest of the residue which is left. So we've taken that into account as well. And we analyzed 10 different cereal, oil, and sugar crops. These were rice, wheat, maize, rye, barley, oats, rapeseed, sugar beet, sugar cane, and sorghum. And crop residues sort of play a very important role in agriculture. They sort of are important to maintain the soil structure and also its carbon content. So based on available literature, we assume that 30 to 60% of the crop residues can be sustainably captured. Now, the most important current use of crop residues is being sort of fed to animals. And so we assumed if we can collect 30 to 60% and a proportion of it is going to go to the animals, which again, we do not want to mess with, even keeping that aside, we are left with about 25 to 35% of crop residues, which can be captured and collected, and you can generate energy from it, digestate from it. Then the fourth category of feedstocks is energy crops. And I would like to specifically mention here that we assume that no land use is changed. So it's only 7% of agricultural land which is used for energy crop production. And this is based on the EU regulation, which limits it to 7%. And we also assume that this is not, this is done as a part of sustainable double cropping or rotational cropping and cover crop schemes where there's a third crop. And the fifth one is sewage sludge from domestic wastewater. So that, if you add up all of those, there is a potential to generate about 12,000 terawatt hours of energy every year. What does that mean in realistic terms? It means that if we take the biogas produced and upgrade all of it to biomethane and inject it into the grid, not that we are recommended that that should be done, we use the energy in however it is needed in the local environment. But if we were to do it, if we were to upgrade all of the energy, then it can replace 32% of the natural gas that we are currently using around the globe. If it was used to produce electricity, it can substitute 19% of electricity from fossil fuels, from the current mix of energy generation of the world. Yep. So in terms of greenhouse gas abatement potential of AD, we can mitigate up to 12%. So this is 10 to 13%. This is the mid-case scenario that I've presented, but between low and high, it's 10 to 13% of greenhouse gas emissions. And to sort of calculate this, we assume the current emission factors for energy generation, which is a mix of fossil fuel-based energy and renewable energy sources. In addition to avoiding emissions from electricity and heat production, we took into account avoided landfill emissions from food waste, which is where if you don't capture it separately, then it ends up in landfill with the rest of your refuse, and it's sort of causes greenhouse methane emissions. So we looked at the percentage of methane emissions that potentially originate from food waste, and those would be avoided. In terms of livestock, we took into account emissions abated from manure management. In crop residues, we took into account crop burning emissions in addition to the energy. And for all of these categories, we also looked at emissions avoided from fertilizer production. Yep. And the third one is nutrient recycling. Now, digestate is really rich in nutrients. All the nutrients that are there in our food waste, in our crop residues, sewage, livestock manure are all there in the digestate, except for the carbon that we take out as methane in biogas. So we only evaluated nutrient capture benefits of food waste and sewage. Now, the reason we did not consider livestock manure in it is that we assumed that in current practice, in current sustainable practice, basically the slurry is applied to land anyways. So all the nutrients are being applied to the land as a part of farming practice. So there is nothing that the digestate is adding to it. It does. So we have empirical evidence that digestate, the anaerobic digestion of manure or other feedstocks makes the nutrients more available, but it depends a lot on the soil type, how the digestate is applied, what crops are grown, and there are a number of variables on that. So we've just assumed like a zero benefit of that. And even in crop residues, I think the current practice is because burning of crop residues is banned in a lot of parts of the world. So we assume that they're either fed to the animals or they're plowed in. So again, anaerobic digestion in the most conservative assumption is not adding very much in terms of nutrient circulation. But in terms of food waste and sewage, those are the nutrients that are lost in landfills or to water. And if we capture that through the digestate, there is a potential to fertilize 82 million hectares of land. And okay, so currently we are at 2% of the total potential of the industry. So what can we do to realize this huge potential of AD? In this report, we looked at 2030 and 2050 as our hypothetical scenarios. We estimated what the potential would be in 2050. Say for our food waste, we would have hopefully quartered it to our current food waste. The energy mix of the world would have changed with higher proportions of renewable energy. So the greenhouse gas abatement benefit of AD will probably in the next 30 years reduce or change. Then the increased population would mean more sewage generation. Higher crop yields are likely with improvement in technology resulting in more crop residues. So taking all of these into account, we estimated the total potential of the industry by 2050. And if biogas industry aims to realize its potential by 2050, what is it that we need to do by 2030? And where do the collection rates need to be by then? And what are the high-level policies that are required to realize that potential? So the rest of the report was on making recommendations. So I will hand over to David now to talk about the policies.
Thank you, Sarika. That's a very comprehensive presentation, and I'm sure that there will be questions about it. But that was very clear. Thank you very much. As the report, if you go to page 46 of the report, we talk about the policies that are necessary, and you will have no problem in understanding from the slide that Sarika has put up there for me what we think that we need to do. We're in a world, ladies and gentlemen, where we actually spend 6.5% of global gross domestic product on subsidizing coal, oil, and gas, which is rather contradictory to our aim to achieve a reduction in emissions from greenhouse gases caused by burning these fuels. So on the one hand, we are fighting climate change. On the other hand, we are subsidizing the very fuels which are creating climate change. Now, I'm not the only one to realize this. The IMF and the World Bank have been signaling this for some years now. But the amount of tax money, in other words, your taxpayers' money in your country, including here in Great Britain, which goes to subsidize fossil fuels around the world, is somewhere in the region of $5 trillion. So you don't have to be a genius to actually think that, well, if we were to remove some of these fossil fuel subsidies quickly in some cases, more gradually in others, where they subsidize the cost of fuel for poor people in developing countries, and were to use some of those $5 trillion to promote renewable energies, including biogas, well, then actually we would not be any longer in contradiction with our policy of trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, some people will argue that gas and oil are transitions and we need to continue to support them. I don't know how much longer we can continue to accept that argument, given the pace at which climate change is racing ahead. The other thing which governments can do is to actually get real and understand that climate change is upon us now, has been upon us for some time, and to make binding targets which tackle that and to put our economies globally onto a war footing. If climate change is as serious as the scientists who study this tell us, then we have to really tackle it in a very, very urgent way. Now, countries like the United Kingdom and others have declared that by 2050, they are aiming and have an ambition to have zero emissions, net zero emissions. Now, that's an extraordinarily ambitious task because it doesn't just regard energy, it doesn't just regard heat or transport, but it also regards products, materials. Think of the plastics industry, which is made from fossil fuels, for example. Now, how are we going to come to net zero emissions? Well, we're going to come to them by turning some of those fossil fuel subsidies and taxpayers' money round into investing in big way into renewable energies and into clean materials. We also suggest that governments who have the task of submitting their climate change plans next year to the Climate Change Secretariat, that they include within their energy plans a target for biogas. Targets are very important because then people, industry, policymakers, and investors have an idea of where government policy is going to go over the medium to long term. So if you were to make a target to say that you wish 5% of your energy mix to come from biogas by 2030, then you have to do things to achieve that target. And so with energy plans, so with greenhouse gas abatement targets. If you're going to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, you're actually going to tell us, well, how are we going to do that? And anaerobic digestion can be part of that. Then there's not just the question of subsidies, there's also the question of incentives. It seems that every time the anaerobic digestion industry speaks to a minister, and I speak to them very regularly, you feel like a beggar. you say, come on, Minister, open the checkbook and make a check out, please, to give an incentive for biogas plants. And I can assure you that traveling around the world, ministers look at you and say, oh, here's another beggar asking for money. But actually, we may be a beggar asking for a small amount of money, but meanwhile, those ministers are writing out very, very big, much bigger checks to the fossil fuel industry in almost every country I go to. And sometimes, as we've seen with wind power and solar power, as we've seen with electric vehicles, you do need government support to get an industry off the ground. And you cannot have fossil fuel subsidies on one hand and not have incentives for renewable energy on the other. We need to up our game as an industry on the way we use digestate and the way we regulate it, the quality protocols we have for it and the use of it. And of course, we need to do all of this within a strategy which at a national and international level works towards a circular economy whereby materials go into a system and are reused and circulated back into the same system. And as the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has pointed out, the food system internationally is extraordinarily wasteful. As we have urbanized as human beings, we have stopped that virtuous cycle of putting our food back to soil. Our food is now it goes into cities and stays in cities. It doesn't go back to the land. And 30% of our topsoil around the world is in serious state of degradation. So we really need to get that food waste, sewage sludge, and other waste which goes with our food into the cities back out again to the countryside and back to soil. There's a lot of other things that we can do, and ladies and gentlemen, you can read this in the report, and I will be very, very quick here. As we do urbanize, of course, then we need sanitation. We have to stop pumping sewage into streams and rivers and actually collect it and harness it and use both the nutrients to put them back to soil and the energy to create both energy for sewage plants themselves and to feed back into the energy grid. Now, in the United Kingdom, 84% of all our sewage infrastructure has anaerobic digestion plants using the sewage sludge as a feedstock. It's very, very well-established technology, which is quite easy to implement anywhere in the world. As Sarika has said, in Europe by 2023, we will have separate food waste collections obligatorily mandated by the EU throughout all 28 countries, including my own United Kingdom. And that will mean millions of tons, tens of million tons more food waste coming from citizens, but also from businesses and requiring treatment. Now, what a fantastic opportunity that is for the anaerobic digestion industry to capture that food waste, to harness the energy and the nutrients from it. But this is not just about Europe. Wherever we look around the world, we are seeing very, very few examples of cities actually undertaking separate food waste collections. Food waste still goes in a huge majority of the world directly to landfill or to open dumping, or in the countryside, as Sarika has said, to feeding animals. That's fine. That's top of the hierarchy, get it back to animals. But where you're living in a city, you have to start thinking, wherever you are, about harnessing that food waste, collecting it separately, taking it out of the waste stream and putting it into producing energy and nutrients. And the same goes, of course, for businesses. The United States has been quite forward and progressive, you'll be surprised to hear, in some of the states in promoting both anaerobic digestion and nutrient recovery plans for some of its farms. California is very much ahead in this. And again, if we can look at soil as being a critical natural capital which we have to maintain, then we have to think about helping farms and helping the agricultural business maintain soils through nutrient recovery plans. And really, the whole agricultural production system, as I said before, is out of balance. And to have such sustainability and greenhouse gas criteria for farming is one very, very big step. Here in the United Kingdom, our National Farmers Union has also declared 2050, I believe, or 2030, 2050 to be net zero emissions from British agriculture. And finally, we can't do it all alone. We need some government spending, and you know, you buy a car and you get on the road. Well, you didn't build the road, the government did, and you get on a plane and you go to an airport. Well, who built the airport? Taxpayers' money originally, and we need some help also to ensure that the biomethane infrastructure is fit for purpose, so that where we are producing biogas, we can upgrade it into biomethane and either feed it into grids or actually feed it into transport. So these are the things that excuse me, Robert. These are the things that we can ask governments to do. Sarika, is there any more slides?
No, that's it, David.
Okay, well, that's it. Now, I therefore throw the floor open to our 120 participants who are logged in. If there are any questions from you, now is the time to ask them. I do suggest you go and download the report, which is on our website, and there's an executive summary too on our website. And if you do have any questions, please share them with Sarika and I by email, and we'll be very, very happy to answer them. Following this webinar, you will be able to follow our events on the WBA website. We have a whole series of events coming up over the next few months, as we do every year, and we'll be very happy to see you at some of those.